Hello, and thank you for listening to the AT Tapes, a podcast from the Journal of Athletic Training. The goal of this podcast is to interview researchers and clinicians on current topics facing athletic trainers and discuss how we can utilize best practices to improve patient outcomes. My name is Lizzie Hibberd, and I will be the host for this podcast. I am a faculty member in the athletic training program at the University of Alabama, and I have a research interest in shoulder and elbow injury prevention in youth overhead athletes. You can follow me on Twitter at @EEHibberd. Before getting started on today's episode, I wanted to remind everyone that all content from JAT is open access, meaning it's free of charge to all readers thanks to funding from the National Athletic Trainers Association. This month, the Journal of Athletic Training released a special thematic issue on training load and recovery monitoring and management. The importance of assessing training load and recovery in determining one's risk of injury is an evolving area in which athletic trainers play a vital role. This thematic issue includes concept papers that evaluate the role of using training load metrics for injury prevention and new research on training load, injury, and injury prevention. In today's episode, we have Dr. Darin Padua from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and Dr. Jimmy Onate from the Ohio State University. Darin and Jimmy are associate editors of the Journal of Athletic Training and were the co-editors of this special issue. So before we get started with the interview, I do want to introduce the guests. So we'll start with Darin. Darin is a professor and chair in the Department of Exercise and Sports Science at the University of Chapel Hill. And as a fun fact, was the program director when I was a student in the athletic training program at UNC. His primary research interests focus on understanding factors that influence knee stability, identification of risk factors associated with knee injury, identification of evidence-based prevention strategies for knee injury, and validation of performance enhancement training techniques. So Darin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Lizzie. Happy to be here.
So will you start out by telling us a little bit about your educational background and how you got into the position that you're currently in?
Sure. Well, I've been here at UNC in the Department of Exercise and Sports Science since 2001. So this is my 20th year on faculty. And a little fun fact about me and Jimmy is that we were actually grad students together at UNC in the master's program and actually worked men's lacrosse as athletic training master students together. So we go back quite some ways, and I guess that's probably like 1996 or something like that we were working together. But I was lucky after I finished up my PhD at UVA in 2001 to have been able to join the faculty at UNC. I started up, as you mentioned, as our program director in the athletic training program. And then for the last, 7 years now, have been working as department chair here in exercise and sports science.
So why did you become an athletic trainer all those years ago?
Well, when I got to college, I really didn't have a lot of background as to what athletic training was at that time. There wasn't an athletic trainer in my high school, so I'd never really been formally introduced to one up to that point in time. But there was an elective class I took my freshman year called Intro to Sports Medicine, and in that class, they introduced the profession of athletic training, and I thought that was intriguing with the kind of combination of sport and medicine. Which is something that I think attracts a lot of students. And so the following semester, I volunteered for an observer program and had the opportunity to see firsthand, what it was like to be a athletic training student at that point in time, and decided it was something that was really appealing to me to be able to work hands-on with individuals and take what I was learning from the classroom and apply it directly during my clinical rotations. I thought was something that would really appeal to me, and made the decision to major in athletic training and have never looked back and enjoyed the pathway up to this point in time.
So now I'll introduce Jimmy. Jimmy is an associate professor and the athletic training program director in the School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences in the College of Medicine at The Ohio State University. His main research focus lies in developing functional motion assessment research that bridges the gap across research to clinical systems to allow for evidence-based outcomes for aiding individuals to sustain optimal health and performance throughout their careers and lives. Jimmy, welcome to the podcast.
So, Lizzie, thank you. I was listening to the introduction. I was like, oh, that sounds pretty good. For me, the background was very interesting. So I was a high school sophomore. I still vividly remember this, sitting in a high school class and having career day where people used to come in from different careers. And gentleman from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, an engineering school just up the road from my hometown, Anthony Ortolano. Anthony is a New York State Hall of Famer, athletic trainer for years. Kind of described his day to me. And I was absolutely fascinated by it. I still didn't know what an athletic trainer was. I was just thinking this is something sports medicine, and I really like that. I like sports, and I like the medicine side of things. And so that kind of got me started. I went on a couple of different pathways in college, playing baseball and doing some other things. And it's funny, almost 30 years later, I'm still doing all those different things. But I went to undergrad, University of Florida, and then I did my master's and my PhD at University of North Carolina. Some great people at both places, and University of North Carolina, where Darin and I met, it really kind of established a brand new world for me, from everything from clinical to education to research, and been doing that life for a little while now. And it's been a great journey, and I look forward to continuing it.
Thank you for introducing yourself, and for both of you guys for being here. We are looking forward to both your expertise as researchers and also as editors of this issue. So can you guys tell us a little bit about where the idea for this special thematic issue came from, and sort of the process that it went through in putting it together?
Sure. Really, the idea, as I recall, came from our editor-in-chief, Jay Hurdle. Jimmy and I were at a meeting, and Jay pulled us aside and said, he had this idea for a special issue around the concept related to training load, as it was a emerging topic that we're seeing more and more publications come out around this idea of training load and its relationship to injury, and thought it would be something really interesting to try to pull together a special issue around. And so that was really the concept itself. And, Jay was great in allowing both Jimmy and I to have some creative license to think about what different directions that we would want to try and take this. So we, each individually thought about different aspects and topics that would relate to this, broad area of training load and injury. And, each of us, thought of different authors that might be great to solicit for more clinical commentary style articles, but then also what would be some original research articles that could also be published around this central theme. And we kind of worked together to identify our collective group of folks we'd wanted to invite, and then try to solicit ideas for original research manuscripts related to this theme of, training load and recovery and how it relates back to injury.
So at the beginning of every episode, I try to define the terminology, or have the speakers define the terminology, because I think that that's one important thing to make sure we're kind of all talking the same language. So just in reviewing the issue, I had identified if you guys could define training load, recovery monitoring, and recovery management as kind of the ones that I had identified. And if there's other terminology that you guys as experts in the area feel like people interchange or use inappropriately, if you guys could kind of hit on this.
Well, when I think of internal training load, I think more of that's how an individual responds to the workload that they're actually performing. So, a simple example might be someone's rating of perceived exertion after, conducting some level of training, or perhaps maybe even like a heart rate measurement. So it's more this kind of physiological response or perceptual response to conducting some type of physical workload, whereas external training load is trying to quantify in some way, shape, or form the actual physical workload that the individual has performed. And that could be in a number of different forms. You could be, using GPS to measure how far a person traveled or how fast they were running, or maybe even something like a pitch count when looking at a sport like baseball could be examples of external training load. And then recovery monitoring is really other things that go along with measuring that person's response to the physical workload that they have performed. And it could be like a wellness type of survey that you'll see some individuals begin to incorporate. And then the management piece is really trying to take all this information about the physical workload, how they're responding from either a physiological, perceptual standpoint, how they're perceiving their health and wellness, and then using that to try and direct patient care to optimize recovery and hopefully improve performance, and in doing those things, minimize risk of injury.
Yeah, I mean, just to add a little bit to those things, I mean, a lot of people get caught up into one area of workload monitoring or one area of recovery, whether that be they have a physiological background or a biomechanical background or a psychological background, and they kind of stick in that area. I think one of the things to look at these definitions is that they're broad across those pieces. Darin said the internal and external workload. What we have to think about as clinicians is there's a variety that goes into this. We tend to stick with what we are familiar with. So all of us have a biomechanical background. So things of that nature are a little bit easier for us to understand. And when we start thinking about some of the psychological or the physiological pieces, they're a little bit different for us. So I think one of the big things on those definitions is really just, what are some of the demands that are being placed on individuals, and what are some of the processes to monitor those demands and to evaluate what impact those demands have on the quote unquote human system.
So thank you for giving us that overview of how this issue was put together and some of the terminology. So the next set of questions I'm going to ask you are really, really big, broad questions, really kind of summarizing the issue. So usually on the podcast, we're focusing on one article. And so this will be an interesting experience for you all of really summarizing a lot of great information. And so as they're summarizing the information, they may specifically reference some of the articles that are available that are linked in the show notes for this. So they'll also be kind of pointing you in the direction of your own self-discovery in this. So the first question is, we know these terms, we know it's important, but what things are actually important to measure when you're evaluating training load? And there is a variety of clinical commentaries, original research. And so kind of as you look at all of that as a whole from this thematic issue, what's really sticking out as the main things that are important to evaluate?
That's probably one of the biggest things is we have so many different things that we can measure, and trying to narrow down what's going to be the most important measurement. So, if you look at the baseball monitoring piece, is it going to be monitoring the pitch counts, which is a nationwide piece? Or is it going to be monitoring the amount of rest in between games? Or is it going to be monitoring the actual accelerations that are occurring at the shoulder or elbow? That's a decision that goes into the researchers and the clinicians' backgrounds and understanding those things. So, it's not an easy decision to go into understanding what factors you want to measure. But I would say that's probably the most important part is we can measure a lot of things right now. What is obviously the accuracy of those pieces, and then what's the reliability, what's the cost? What is the cost benefit ratio on measuring those things? And then what problem is it trying to solve on those pieces?
Yeah, just to follow up on Jimmy's point there, I think, in terms of what is important to measure, I think it depends. It depends on perhaps, the sport that you're working with, which you might want to focus on for swimming might be very different from what you would want to focus on for baseball. So I think it can be, sport or athlete specific in terms of that physical workload measure that you would want to utilize. And then I think, as Jimmy alluded to, it's also important to think about what are you going to do with the information. I think what we don't want to do is just, create more work and measure things just for measuring them. But how are you going to use this information to help guide clinical decision-making as part of the overall kind of sport medicine, sport performance team in terms of how to best manage that athlete, that patient from a injury prevention and performance enhancement standpoint? And I think all that kind of guides then what are the right measures to choose in your given scenario.
So one question that I have about some of the measurement stuff is a lot of times in the research we see that it requires special equipment or can sometimes be cost prohibitive. So can you talk a little bit about measuring and monitoring that a clinician could potentially do with limited resources to still be able to gather valuable information?
Questionnaires is a great monitoring system. We have some, pieces of articles here that are about, one question or an overall, how do you feel, may not be as good as, a little bit more detailed questionnaire. Phone apps that are very, very simple, low cost, to be able to do some of the overall wellness tracking type of ideas. Some very simple aspects of different apps that can kind of, on your phones, that can be able to do a little bit of a step counter or those types of things to be able to look at your activity levels. Again, going back to baseball that I was involved in, a simple pitch count and accuracy, or a simple throwing counter, where somebody's just counting, on a little clicker, which is very, inexpensive, the number of throws a pitcher has in warm-ups, the number of pitchers has, in the bullpen, the number of pitches a pitcher has in the game or in between innings, and looking at all those things. There are definitely many capabilities to do this at what we call a low-tech side, or a no-tech side. And those will be, again, the accuracy may be missing a little bit, or the jazziness of it, the sexiness of it may be missing a little bit, but you still get a lot of good information from it. But it's also not as easy as some people make it out to be. There still takes time, effort. Again, what's the cost benefit of those things, because somebody's taking the time and effort to be able to track these things.
So I think one of the other questions that a lot of people have is this information that we gather and get is, how has that been identified, or has it been identified as injury risk factors? So although this is a young science, what is the science currently telling us about injury risk factors related to training load?
It's an emerging area, and I think right now what we're seeing is just generally some inconsistencies in what the research is reporting, and that could be driven by a lot of various things, such as the type of metrics that are being used to quantify training load, the populations that are being studied, types of injuries that are being tracked, and so forth. But I think generally what we're beginning to see emerge as a relationship is that when an individual begins to increase their workload, above which they're normally used to carrying, that might put them at a greater risk of injury at some point down the road, essentially. How strong of an association that is, how much of an increase does a person have to experience in their acute workloads to actually sort of be at greater risk? I think all those are questions that still remain to be, answered. But it seems that when there's this big imbalance, that it may predispose to injury down the road. I don't think what anyone is proposing is that when you see a person's workload begin to increase, perhaps at a rate that might suggest that they could be at risk for injury, that you shut them down and don't have them, but more you have that in the back of your mind as a possibility, and perhaps you need to manage them a little more closely, and perhaps give them a little bit more recovery time, or be mindful of that during subsequent training sessions, so they don't get closer and closer to perhaps going into a position where they might actually sustain injury.
Yeah, just to follow up Darin's piece is, there's not a one-size-fits-all on this model. It's not going to apply to every single individual at every single pace. I liken it to monitoring cars. I got a phone call from my older son in Maine today, and he said, "Dad, I can't drive. My coolant lights went on." And I said, "Well, it's probably going to be okay to go a couple miles to get some antifreeze in your car." And he's deathly afraid of doing that, so he's not driving that car. So, the human systems, again, we have decisions to make. These are tools that give us more information. But as Darin said, it's not that we automatically stop and we're going to save everybody, or we push through it and everybody's going to get hurt. It's there's some art to the science on these pieces, and we're just now getting more science to go with that. But a lot of times it's been, coaches knowing when to push, when to pull back, obviously some different cycling pieces. And, as far as, where we are in the training cycles. And we're just getting more information on these things. And it doesn't automatically make it better. It just gives us more pieces of information to make more informed decisions.
So you talked a little bit about these spikes and how that might relate to pulling back a little bit on training or adjusting their training that they're doing. But can you talk about how this might apply post-injury as somebody is beginning to return to play or as part of their rehabilitation?
Well, one of the things post-injury, it's always been an interesting thing to me, is that we want to get them back to quote unquote pre-injury status. Now, sometimes pre-injury status is a very good thing, right? So they were in very good shape, or they were very, very fit. But sometimes pre-injury status is why they got injured. And so just getting back to pre-injury status shouldn't be the goal. We need to look at what's the best system for them. So I think looking at, if we want to look at some things like hamstring strains, and we want to look at that aspect from a strength standpoint. Are we back to normal? Well, pre-injury status, what quote unquote was normal, may have caused the risk for injury. For the workload of the hamstrings, maybe that's what caused that, and we want to go kind of beyond those pieces. So I think one of my concerns is always saying, well, we want to get them back to quote unquote normal or pre-injury status, and that might not be the best use of this information, but it does give us some more pieces of the puzzle to utilize in making these return to play criteria for different injuries.
As a follow-up, I think, if you're in a position where you are able to, consistently monitor an athlete or a team's, training load levels, that may also be helpful during the rehabilitation, because for that injured athlete, the team is training at a certain level. And if you're monitoring that, what that is now, right? What the physical demands are being asked of the athletes when they're training and competing, essentially. And if you have an athlete who isn't training with the team because they're undergoing rehabilitation, you now know what they need to get back to, ultimately to be unrestricted and practicing with that team. And so that may help you better sort of gauge, when you will allow them to be fully unrestricted in training, because if they're during rehab, at a 50% deficit in training load compared to maybe what the team is doing on a regular basis, even though they may be feeling pretty good, maybe you don't want to let them go completely unrestricted as soon as they've, passed your return to sport testing assessment, whatever that looks like. But you'll want to maybe more gradually progress to get them back to that, same training load level as the rest of the team, so they don't run the risk of having a setback as they, try to immediately ramp back up and match their teammates' training load levels.
So one question that I have is, again, a broad question, but my question is, who takes ownership of this area from a clinical perspective? And I think, Jimmy, at the beginning, you talked about, everyone sort of stays in their lane as far as you're used to biomechanics, so you do biomechanics. But when we're talking about such a broad issue, who really should or could take ownership of that? And then the second part of that question is, what training or resources exist for somebody that wants to get better and learn more about load monitoring and how you use this to make clinical decisions?
Well, that's a great question. First off, there's a whole legal system on these pieces, and every institution and organization structure can decide to put some of this information under medical or outside of medical. And the military and universities and professionals have a variety of different systems set up that are really challenging. I would say that the most important part is what's going to help the individuals and the organizations, the teams, to make informed decisions. So that means everybody has to get along and everybody has to understand each other. That's not the easiest thing in the world. So is there where it should house? Well, yeah, it should house under something that's basically individual focused. Even when you start using the term performance, sport performance takes on a different name if we're talking about it from a rehabilitation standpoint, or we're talking about it from a strength and conditioning standpoint. I firmly believe that a good strength coach knows that the most important ability for an individual is availability. And I know that a medical side is saying the same thing, but oftentimes they're not on the same page. So you're asking an easy question that is not an easy answer. And from a legality standpoint, we have different organizations and unions that are really concerned about whether this monitoring information can be posed back to them and given back to them as far as who owns the data, who gets to market it, who gets to utilize it for contract negotiations, who gets to utilize it for an umpteen number of things. And there's some good legal papers out there on this.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a complicated issue, and that's one of the interesting things will be, I think, sort of seeing play itself out here over the next couple of years as we're able to collect so much information with wearable sensors, not just about a person's workload physically, but also how they're responding as well too. So whose data it is a really important question. I think in the context of the the support team that's taking care of that that athlete. I think in the ideal world, all parties are viewing it as information that they can all use to help better the care and the performance of the athlete. And so I would see that the strength and conditioning staff, the athletic training sports medicine staff, the coaching staff could all hopefully see value of this. And if handled properly, this could be the common set of metrics that each of the parties involved, strength and conditioning, sports medicine, the coaching staff, can come together and talk around to figure out how do we, best work together to optimize these metrics, to prevent injury, to make sure the athlete is available, and then also to help them improve their skill set and their overall performance. But some of these key issues that Jimmy mentioned really, still need to get hashed out and get everyone on the same page so that we can, have those sorts of conversations and keep the kind of the athlete-centric model and have them be the focus so that we can use this information in the right ways to get the best outcomes.
So you guys put together a great issue, really looking at training load and the information that's out there very comprehensively, but there's still a lot of questions that need to be answered. So as you guys are kind of looking at this as a whole, what do you think are the critical questions that still need to be answered, where science really needs to go for us to really use this information?
As it relates to, injury, I still think there's a lot of important questions that need to be answered. Can we really use this information to, really identify, those who are at, high risk for sustaining injury if we look at the right, training load metrics in the right way? I mean, there has been some initial evidence to suggest that that's a possibility, but I still think there's a lot more work that needs to be done in this area. And then also how to best use this, information to kind of guide individuals as they're going through the return to sport and return to performance process to, get them back to their proper, performance levels, but then also doing so in a way that minimizes their risk for a secondary injury. I think, in my mind, those are two areas where I think there's a lot of area for new research to see how we can improve what we're doing in both primary and secondary injury prevention with the incorporation of various ways of monitoring and managing training load metrics.
Yeah, just to follow up, there's been a couple of social media pieces out there on, we need randomized controlled trials in this area to be able to see if workload monitoring and acute chronic workload ratios are really predicting injuries and so on and so forth. I would go back to something that Dr. Bill Garrett, who's recently passed away, and he was great during my time. He was a Duke, North Carolina guy, one of those special breeds that can do both places. And I remember him telling me as a doctoral student that he has the answer to all the ACL injuries in women's soccer. And I remember listening and waiting and so excited about that meeting coming up. And he goes, Jimmy, the easiest thing is to not have him play college soccer. And I was bummed. But, he tried to make something like, okay, there's an inherent risk to things that we do. We're going to push the envelope of all these things. And it doesn't matter in this issue. You see firefighters in this issue. You see dancers. You see baseball players. You see rugby. They're all going to do the same thing. They're all going to try to get as good as they possibly can. With that, there's some inherent risk. What we're trying to do is still help them to get as good as they possibly can while trying to toe the line of, quote unquote injury versus not, while still trying to help them perform as best as possible.
So we've talked a lot about this episode and some of the information in it. And I really appreciate the effort that went into putting this together and your time today in discussing this. So as we finish up this episode, can you provide 1 to 2 sort of take-home messages for how clinicians can use this information to improve their patient outcomes? And we'll start with Jimmy on that one.
For me, it's getting to know your patients a little bit better. So it's really trying to get to know who your patients are. So I'll give you for instance. I'm a high school baseball coach in charge of 55 baseball players when the season starts, from freshmen to seniors. And I run their sport performance piece and handle that side. One of the things that we do is a daily report that basically tells me how their arm soreness is on the day. And it's a very simple 0 to 10 scale. We did a lot of monitoring before. We did, IMUs on the elbow and those types of things. And it works when the kids want it to work. So I would say come up with a process and system that works for you in your location. Don't just automatically go that this XYZ is going to work, because it works at this place. Know what your culture is going to work, know what you want to do with it and how it's going to affect it, and then make sure that you follow through with it. If you don't believe in it, they won't believe in it. So for me, a very simple system of arm soreness on a regular basis is important. Our coaches responding with pitch counts and not going kind of crazy of not so much the pitch count of the day, but the pitch count across the week. Because it's something that I believe in is the overtime component, not the individual day. So and that's kind of my clinician hat is you got to have something that you believe in. And if you don't, nobody else will.
Darin, you're up.
Sure. Well, I think as a take-home point, I would say I agree with Jimmy in that if you're going to do this, think about all the various factors that he mentioned, and I would also say that if you're looking to incorporate these various measures of training load in your daily practice, I think as a good rule of thumb, it's good to look at both a type of internal load as well as external load measure, or if not an internal load measure, something that gives you a sense of how they're responding to whatever the physical workload is. I think if you are looking at both of those sides of the coin, if you will, the physical workload, whatever that metric is that makes sense for the athlete in the sport that you're working with, and then how they're responding, you can have those two sides of the equation to try and balance out. If you see a certain level of workload begins to result in a response that suggests increasing soreness and that sort of pathway, now perhaps you need to do something to either modify the workload or enhance the level of recovery practices that they're engaging in. But if you find that you're increasing that workload and they're responding in a positive manner or in a consistent manner that doesn't suggest increased soreness or fatigue or whatever that sort of marker would be of a negative trend, then perhaps that means you can continue to increase and build them up, and they're still, having a positive response, and that can help, provide some guidance for how you, want to manage their workload from one day to the next. So I think looking at both the kind of the loading metric as well as a response metric can be helpful in just sort of the day-to-day management of the athlete. And I wouldn't recommend trying to get too much into trying to predict injury when they're going to get injured, but more use the information to guide how you want to manage that person on a day-to-day basis versus trying to, worry about predicting injury at some point down the road.
Well, thank you all for joining us today and for your expertise in this area and the effort that you put in putting this issue together. We really appreciate it.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Lizzie.
I hope you all found this podcast informative and that you can utilize the clinical recommendations to improve patient care. That is it for today's The AT Tapes. Please remember to rate and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Also, please follow the Journal of Athletic Training on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at JAT_NATA on all 3 platforms. Thank you for listening, and I hope you will join us for next month's episode of the AT Tapes.
Thanks.